June 26, 1943. Robert Johnson's P-47 took over 200 bullets from a German ace. His canopy was jammed shut. He couldn't bail out. The German pilot flew alongside, close enough to see Johnson's face, and saluted. He thought the American was already dead. Johnson flew that shattered aircraft 90 miles back to England. Hello, my friends. I'm Matt Donovan, a 73-year-old military historian from the University of Massachusetts, and you're watching WW2 Visualized. I've spent 50 years studying the aircraft that won the war, but this story still amazes me. Today we're talking about a plane that everyone said couldn't fly. Too heavy, too big, too slow. They called it a flying milk truck. But the P-47 Thunderbolt became the most devastating fighter bomber of World War II, and it brought more pilots home alive than any aircraft in history. This is the story of the plane that was built around one simple idea: the pilot matters more than the machine. Let's begin. Let me start with a question that might seem strange. What makes an aircraft truly great? Speed. The Spitfire was faster in a dive. Maneuverability. The Zero could turn inside anything the Allies had. Range. The Mustang could fly farther. Firepower. The German Me-262 had cannons that could tear a bomber apart. The P-47 Thunderbolt wasn't the best at any of these things. On paper, it shouldn't have been a great fighter at all. It was the heaviest single-engine fighter of World War II. It weighed more than some twin-engine aircraft. Pilots who transferred from Spitfires called it a flying bathtub. German pilots who first saw it laughed. They thought Americans had sent cargo planes to fight. And yet, by the end of the war, P-47s had destroyed more enemy aircraft than any other American fighter. They had dropped more bombs than any other fighter bomber in the European theater. They had flown more combat sorties than any other American aircraft. And here's the statistic that matters most. P-47s brought more pilots home alive than any fighter in history. Not because it was the fastest, not because it was the most agile, but because the man who designed it understood something that most aircraft designers forgot. A pilot is not a replaceable component. A pilot is a human being with a family waiting for him. And every engineering decision, every pound of armor, every inch of fuel line, every redundant system should serve one purpose: bringing that pilot home. This is the story of Alexander Kartveli, a Georgian refugee who designed the most survivable fighter of World War II, and the pilots who proved that sometimes the best aircraft isn't the one that fights hardest, it's the one that refuses to die. To understand the P-47, you need to understand the man who created it. And to understand Alexander Kartveli, you need to understand what he escaped. Alexander Kartveli was born in Tbilisi, Georgia, on September 9, 1896. Not Georgia, the American state, Georgia, the ancient kingdom at the crossroads of Europe and Asia, wedged between the Black Sea and the Caucasus Mountains, a land that had been conquered by Persians, Romans, Mongols, and Ottomans, and somehow survived them all. The Kartveli family was educated and prosperous. Young Alexander showed an early gift for mathematics and engineering. He enrolled at the highest school of war in Paris to study military engineering, then transferred to the prestigious École Supérieure d'Aéronautique, the leading aviation school in France. This was 1917. The world was at war, and aviation was the most exciting frontier of technology. Aircraft had evolved from fragile kites to genuine weapons in barely a decade. The future belonged to whoever could master the sky. Kartveli graduated in 1922 with honors. He had job offers from aviation companies across Europe. His future seemed secure. Then came news from home. The Bolsheviks had taken Georgia. The independent republic that had emerged after the Russian Revolution lasted barely 3 years before the Red Army invaded. Kartveli's family lost everything. His homeland became a Soviet republic. If he returned, he would be building aircraft for Stalin. He never went back. Instead, Kartveli took a job with a French aircraft company. He designed fighters, racers, experimental aircraft. He was good, very good, but France in the 1920s was not a place of opportunity. The aviation industry was stagnant. Military budgets were shrinking. There was no future there. In 1927, Kartveli received a letter from America. Charles Levine, an American aviation entrepreneur, was looking for talented European designers. He had heard about the Georgian engineer with unconventional ideas. Would Kartveli be interested in coming to New York? Kartveli arrived in America in 1928 with a suitcase, a thick accent, and a notebook full of designs that no one in Europe had wanted to build. He was 32 years old. He had no money, no connections, and no reputation in his new country. But he had something more valuable. He had spent a decade watching aircraft fail, watching pilots die because designers cared more about speed and beauty than survival. And he had developed a philosophy that would eventually save thousands of lives. The pilot must come home. Kartveli's first American job was with the Atlantic Aircraft Corporation, which soon became part of a company called Seversky Aircraft. The founder was another immigrant, Alexander Seversky, a Russian pilot who had lost a leg in combat during World War I and still managed to become a naval ace. Two Alexanders. Two refugees from the Russian Empire. Two men who understood what it meant to lose everything except your skills and your determination. Seversky was the visionary, the salesman, the man who could charm investors and politicians. Kartveli was the engineer, the perfectionist, the man who spent nights in the drafting room solving problems that others said couldn't be solved. Together, they created the P-35, America's first all-metal fighter with retractable landing gear and an enclosed cockpit. It wasn't revolutionary, but it was solid. It proved that these two refugees could build aircraft that met American military standards. Then came the XP-41, an improved version, and then the P-43 Lancer. Each aircraft was heavier than the last. Each had more armor, more fuel capacity, more redundant systems. Other designers mocked Kartveli's approach. Speed was everything, they said. Maneuverability was everything. Armor just added weight. Kartveli disagreed. He had studied the losses in the Spanish Civil War, where modern air combat was being invented. He had analyzed reports from China, where Japanese and Chinese pilots were fighting daily. He noticed something that the speed-obsessed designers missed. The pilots who survived weren't necessarily the ones in the fastest aircraft. They were the ones whose aircraft could absorb damage and keep flying. They were the ones who had enough fuel to get home when the fight went longer than expected. They were the ones whose engines didn't catch fire from a single lucky bullet. Survival wasn't about avoiding all damage. That was impossible. Survival was about taking damage and still coming home. In 1940, the U.S. Army Air Corps issued a requirement for a new fighter. They wanted speed. They wanted altitude. They wanted firepower. Kartveli looked at the requirement and saw an opportunity. The Army wanted a fighter powered by the new Pratt & Whitney R2800 double Wasp engine, the most powerful aircraft engine America had ever built. It produced over 2,000 horsepower. It was massive. It was heavy. And it needed enormous amounts of air to breathe. Most designers would have built the smallest possible aircraft around that engine. Minimize weight, maximize speed. Kartveli did the opposite. If the engine was going to be huge anyway, why not use that size? Why not build an aircraft with enough internal space for hundreds of gallons of fuel? Why not add armor around the cockpit, around the oil cooler, around every critical system? Why not install 8 heavy machine guns instead of 6? Why not make the aircraft so structurally strong that it could dive at speeds that would tear other fighters apart? The result was a monster. The XP-47 prototype weighed over 13,000 pounds fully loaded, nearly twice the weight of a Spitfire. It was huge. The propeller alone was 12 feet in diameter. The fuselage was so wide that pilots said it looked like a pregnant whale. When Army Air Corps officers first saw it, they were skeptical. When they compared its specifications to the sleek Mustang or the elegant Spitfire, they were doubtful. When they read reports comparing its maneuverability to the nimble Zero, they were concerned. But Kartveli had anticipated every objection. Yes, the P-47 was heavy, but that weight was armor and fuel and ammunition. Yes, it was big, but that size meant room for the most powerful engine ever fitted to a fighter. Yes, it was less maneuverable at low altitude, but at high altitude, above 20,000 feet where the strategic air war would be fought, the turbo-supercharged R2800 gave it performance that nothing else could match. And there was something else, something that didn't show up in specification sheets. The P-47 was almost impossible to kill. The engine could take multiple hits and keep running. The fuel tanks were self-sealing. If a bullet punctured them, a special rubber lining would swell and close the hole. The armor behind the pilot could stop a 20mm cannon shell. The radial engine itself acted as a shield. Unlike liquid-cooled engines, which would die from a single bullet in the coolant line, the R-2800 could lose entire cylinders and still produce enough power to fly home. Republic Aviation, the new name for Seversky's company, received a contract for 773 aircraft. Production began in 1942. The first P-47s arrived in England in January 1943, and that's when the real test began. If you're finding this story as fascinating as I do, take a moment to subscribe to the channel. We release these deep dives every week, and your support helps more than you know. The American pilots who first flew the P-47 were not impressed. Most of them had trained on smaller, lighter aircraft. Some had flown Spitfires with the RAF before America entered the war. They were expecting something nimble, something that could dance with the German fighters they'd heard so much about. Instead, they got a 7-ton beast that climbed like a tired elevator and turned like a city bus. The complaints were immediate and loud. It's a flying milk truck. You don't fly the jug, you wear it. I've seen faster tractors. The nickname stuck, the Jug, short for Juggernaut. It was not meant as a compliment. Hub Zemka, commanding officer of the 56th Fighter Group, had his work cut out for him. Zemka was a natural leader, intense, demanding, brilliant at tactics. He had studied German fighter operations and knew exactly what his pilots would face. Messerschmitt Bf-109s and Focke-Wulf W-190s flown by veterans with years of combat experience. His pilots had virtually none. The 56th Fighter Group, which would become known as Zemk's Wolfpack, flew their first combat mission on April 15, 1943. They were escorting B-17 bombers to Belgium. Nothing happened. No German fighters appeared. The next few missions were the same. The pilots began to relax. Maybe this wouldn't be so bad. Then came April 29th. The 56th was escorting bombers again when a swarm of FW-190s hit them from above. The German pilots, veterans of the Eastern Front, knew exactly what they were doing. They dove through the American formation at high speed, fired, and kept going before the P-47s could react. In the chaos, the Americans got separated. Individual pilots found themselves alone against 2 or 3 Germans. The radios filled with confused shouting. When it was over, the 56th had lost 3 pilots. They had shot down nothing. The next few weeks were a harsh education. The Germans had every advantage: experience, better tactics, home field. They knew when to fight and when to run. They attacked the bombers when the P-47s were out of position, then vanished before the Americans could respond. But something else became apparent in those early weeks. Something that the specification sheets had promised and combat was now confirming. P-47s were taking damage that would have destroyed any other fighter and coming home. One pilot took a 20mm cannon shell through his engine cowling. The shell didn't explode, but it tore through several cylinders. He flew 50 miles on reduced power and landed safely. Another pilot had his control cables partially severed by machine gun fire. He nursed the aircraft back using trim tabs and emergency procedures, touched down, and counted 37 bullet holes in his fuselage. A third pilot dove too steeply while chasing a German and exceeded 500 miles per hour, a speed that would have torn the wings off a Spitfire. His P-47 shuddered but held together. He pulled out of the dive with his wings intact. Zemka noticed, and he began to develop tactics that used the P-47's unique strengths instead of fighting against its weaknesses. Don't turn with a 109, you'll lose. Don't climb with a 190, you'll lose. But dive on them from above, hit them with 850 caliber machine guns, and keep going. Use your speed. Use your weight. Use the fact that you can absorb hits that would kill them. And above all, stay alive to fight tomorrow. The tactics worked. By summer 1943, the 56th Fighter Group was no longer the hunted. They were becoming the hunters. Now I want to tell you about a pilot who embodied everything Kartveli designed the P-47 to be. Robert Samuel Johnson was born in Lawton, Oklahoma on February 21, 1920. His father was a machinist who fixed anything with an engine. Young Robert spent his childhood taking apart motorcycles and dreaming about airplanes. When he was 8 years old, a barnstormer came through Lawton. For $2, locals could ride in his biplane. Robert didn't have $2, but he had determination. He hung around the airfield, helping the pilot with whatever needed doing, until the barnstormer finally gave him a free ride. That was it. From that moment, Robert Johnson knew he would fly. He joined the Army Air Corps in 1941, just before Pearl Harbor. He was a natural pilot, aggressive, confident, maybe too confident. His instructors praised his flying skills, but worried about his attitude. Johnson thought he was the best pilot in every room. Usually, he was right. Johnson arrived in England with the 56th Fighter Group in January 1943. He was 22 years old, freshly married, and absolutely certain that he would become an ace. The P-47 didn't impress him at first. Like everyone else, he complained about the weight, the sluggish handling, the size. But Johnson was smart enough to learn the aircraft's strengths instead of cursing its weaknesses. By June 1943, Johnson had 4 confirmed victories. He was good, but not yet great. June 26 changed everything. The mission was a bomber escort to France. Johnson's flight was providing high cover when they spotted German fighters below. FW 190s, the best the Luftwaffe had. Johnson dove to attack. He hit one German, saw smoke, but couldn't confirm the kill. Then things went wrong. A 190 got on Johnson's tail. He twisted, turned, dove. Nothing worked. The German was good, very good. Cannon shells slammed into Johnson's P-47. The first hit took out his hydraulic system. The second shattered his canopy, filling the cockpit with wind and noise. The third and fourth punctured his fuselage like a sewing machine. Johnson tried to bail out. The canopy was jammed. The emergency release didn't work. He was trapped in a dying aircraft with a German fighter still shooting at him. More hits. The instrument panel exploded. Oil sprayed across his face. He couldn't see, couldn't hear, couldn't escape. Then the German stopped shooting. Johnson wiped the oil from his eyes and looked out. The FW-190 was flying beside him, maybe 20 feet away. He could see the German pilot clearly. Leather helmet, oxygen mask, gloved hands on the stick. The German looked at Johnson's shattered cockpit, the smoking engine, the riddled fuselage. He clearly believed the American was already dead, just a corpse, flying a wrecked airplane that would crash any moment. The German pilot raised his hand in a salute. Then he rolled away and disappeared. Johnson was alone. His engine was coughing. His instruments were destroyed. He didn't know how high he was, how fast he was going, or where he was. But the engine was still running. The wings were still attached. The controls still responded barely. He turned west toward England. For the next 90 minutes, Robert Johnson flew the most damaged aircraft that had ever made it home. He crossed the English Channel at low altitude, losing power with every mile. When he reached the coast, he didn't try to find his own airfield. He landed at the first runway he saw. Ground crews counted the damage afterward. Over 200 bullet and cannon shell holes. The engine cowling was gone. 3 cylinders were destroyed. The hydraulic system was dead. The rudder cables were hanging by threads. Any other fighter in the world would have disintegrated under that punishment. The P-47 brought Robert Johnson home. After that day, Johnson became one of the deadliest pilots in the European theater. By the time he finished his combat tour, he had 27 confirmed victories, making him the first American pilot in Europe to break Eddie Rickenbacker's World War I record. When reporters asked how he survived so many missions, Johnson gave the same answer every time. The jug. I'm alive because Kartveli built a plane that won't quit. But Johnson wasn't the only pilot discovering what the P-47 could do. Across England, stories were multiplying. Pilots were returning with damage that should have been fatal. The flying milk truck was becoming something else, a legend. Let me tell you about Francis Gabreski. If Robert Johnson was the natural pilot, gifted, aggressive, destined for success, Francis Gabreski was his opposite. Everything came hard for Gabby Gabreski. He earned every victory through sheer determination. Francis Stanley Gabreski was born in Oil City, Pennsylvania, on January 28, 1919. His parents were Polish immigrants who spoke broken English and worked punishing hours to give their children opportunities they'd never had themselves. Gabby, the nickname, followed him everywhere, grew up watching his father labor in the steel mills. He swore he'd find a different path. When he heard about the Army Air Corps, something clicked. Flying was the future. Flying was escape. There was just one problem. Gabreski was a terrible pilot. His instructors at flight school were brutal in their assessments. Slow reflexes, poor situational awareness, dangerous tendencies in the cockpit. He nearly washed out 3 times. Only stubborn persistence kept him in the program. When Gabreski arrived at his first operational squadron, his commander pulled him aside for a frank conversation. "I've read your training reports. You're the worst pilot we've received. Don't get yourself killed before you learn something." It was not an auspicious beginning, but Gabreski had something that training scores couldn't measure. He refused to quit. After Pearl Harbor, the Army sent Gabreski to Hawaii, far from the real fighting. He was so determined to get into combat that he volunteered for a special assignment, liaison duty with a Polish RAF squadron in Britain. The Polish pilots were among the best in the world. They had been fighting the Luftwaffe since 1939. They had escaped the fall of Poland, made their way to Britain, and spent years honing their skills against German veterans. Gabreski flew with them. He learned from them. He absorbed tactics and techniques that American training programs didn't teach. And slowly, painfully, he transformed from the worst pilot in his class into something much more dangerous. When Gabreski joined the 56th Fighter Group in early 1943, he was ready. His first kill came in August, then another, then another. The hesitant student became a calculating hunter. He developed a patient style, watching, waiting, positioning himself for a single decisive attack. He didn't have Johnson's natural aggression or Zemke's tactical brilliance. He had something more sustainable, discipline. By the spring of 1944, Gabreski was the leading American ace in Europe. He had passed Johnson, passed everyone. The kid who nearly flunked flight school was now the most successful fighter pilot in the 8th Air Force, and the P-47 made it possible. Other fighters rewarded natural talent, the quick reflexes, the instinctive maneuvering that some pilots were born with. The P-47 rewarded patience and discipline. It rewarded pilots who used its strengths systematically: the dive, the firepower, the ability to absorb punishment and keep fighting. Gabreski was scheduled to rotate home in July 1944. He had 28 victories, one more than Johnson, enough to be the highest-scoring American ace in Europe. He decided to fly one more mission. July 20th, 1944. Gabreski was strafing a German airfield when he misjudged his altitude. His propeller clipped the ground. The P-47 cartwheeled across the field, shedding pieces, and came to rest in a German wheat field. Gabreski survived the crash because of course he did. It was a P-47. He evaded capture for 5 days before German soldiers found him. He spent the rest of the war in Stalag Luftwaffe. But here's what matters about Gabreski's story, my friends. He wasn't a natural. He wasn't gifted. He was, by every objective measure, a mediocre pilot who should have washed out of flight school. The P-47 made him an ace. Its forgiveness of mistakes, its survivability, its ability to bring damaged aircraft home, these qualities gave Gabreski the time to learn, to improve, to become great. How many other pilots owed their lives to that same forgiveness? How many marginal flyers survived long enough to become good? How many good pilots survived long enough to become great? That was Kartveli's philosophy made real. The pilot must come home. Even the imperfect pilot, even the struggling pilot, even the pilot who clips his propeller on a German airfield and walks away. Now let me tell you about the day that proved what 8 P-47s could do against impossible odds. December 23rd, 1944. The Battle of the Bulge had begun a week earlier. German forces had punched through Allied lines in the Ardennes forest. The weather was terrible: fog, snow, clouds so thick that Allied aircraft couldn't fly. For a week, the German army advanced without interference from the air. They needed that cover. They knew that clear weather would bring death from above. On December 23rd, the weather broke. First Lieutenant Neil Kirby was leading a flight of P-47s from the 348th Fighter Group over the Pacific Theater earlier in the war. But on this day in Europe, it was another group of Thunderbolt pilots who would make history. Major George Preddy was leading a patrol of P-51 Mustangs from the 352nd Fighter Group. But the story I want to tell is about the 56th Fighter Group, Zemke's Wolfpack, and a mission that became legendary. Actually, let me correct myself and tell you about a different mission, one that shows the P-47 at its absolute limit. March 8, 1944. The target was Berlin. This was the first major American daylight raid on the Nazi capital. Over 600 B-17 bombers would strike the heart of the Reich, and for the first time, fighters would escort them all the way there and back. The P-47 couldn't make that trip, not alone. Even with external fuel tanks, it didn't have the range to reach Berlin and return. The deep escort would be handled by P-51 Mustangs, but the P-47s had another job. They would provide withdrawal support, meeting the returning bombers over Germany and escorting them home through the most dangerous stretch of their journey. The 56th Fighter Group launched that morning with 48 aircraft. Hub Zemke was leading. The plan was simple: rendezvous with the bombers over central Germany, protect them from German fighters, get everyone home. Nothing went according to plan. The bombers were late. The rendezvous point was wrong. German fighters were everywhere, hundreds of them launched to defend Berlin. Zemke's pilots found themselves not escorting bombers, but fighting for their lives. The battle that followed lasted nearly an hour. It sprawled across 50 miles of German sky. Individual dogfights merged and separated. Pilots lost track of their wingmen, found new enemies, dove and climbed and fired until their ammunition was gone. When it was over, the 56th Fighter Group had destroyed 16 German aircraft. They had lost 3 pilots. But here's the detail that mattered. 11 P-47s returned with major combat damage. 11 aircraft that, in any other fighter, would have been lost with their pilots. One pilot landed with his engine on fire. Another had lost 6 feet of his left wing to a collision. A third had taken a 20mm shell through his cockpit that missed his head by inches and exited through the floor. All of them made it home. Zemke wrote in his after-action report, "The P-47 continues to demonstrate survivability that exceeds all expectations. Pilots are returning with damage that would be fatal in any other aircraft." Kartveli, reading that report back in his office at Republic Aviation, must have permitted himself a small smile. The pilot must come home, even from Berlin, even through a sky full of German fighters, even with an engine on fire and a wing missing. The P-47 was keeping its promise. But the Thunderbolt's greatest contribution wasn't in air-to-air combat. It was in a role that nobody had originally planned for it. By mid-1944, Allied air superiority over Europe was becoming complete. German fighters were being shot down faster than they could be replaced. Fuel shortages were grounding experienced pilots. The Luftwaffe was dying. This meant that the heavy escort missions, the brutal fights above bomber formations, were becoming less frequent. Fighter groups had excess capacity, so they turned their P-47s toward the ground. The Thunderbolt, it turned out, was the perfect ground attack aircraft. It could carry up to 2,500 pounds of bombs, more than most dedicated bombers from earlier in the war. Its .850 caliber machine guns could destroy anything short of a tank, and its legendary durability meant it could fly through ground fire that would shred other aircraft. Pilots called it train busting and tank plinking. The official term was armed reconnaissance. Whatever you called it, it was devastatingly effective. P-47s roamed across France, Belgium, and Germany, looking for anything that moved. Trains were favorite targets. A locomotive hit by .50 caliber rounds would explode spectacularly. Trucks were easy kills. Even tanks could be destroyed with rockets or bombs or disabled by machine gun fire through their engine compartments. The numbers were staggering. By the end of the war, P-47s had destroyed over 9,000 locomotives. They had destroyed over 86,000 railway cars. They had destroyed over 68,000 trucks. They had destroyed over 6,000 armored vehicles. More importantly, they had made daylight movement behind German lines almost impossible. Supplies couldn't reach the front. Reinforcements couldn't move without being strafed. The German army was being strangled from the air, and the P-47 pilots were doing this at remarkably low cost. Ground attack is dangerous work. You're flying low and slow, directly into enemy guns. Anti-aircraft fire accounts for more aircraft losses than air-to-air combat in most wars. But the P-47 absorbed ground fire like nothing else. Its radial engine could take multiple hits. Its armor protected the pilot. Its self-sealing fuel tanks prevented fires. A P-47 pilot could make a mistake, fly too low, stay too long, take too many hits, and still make it home. That margin for error was worth more than any specification sheet could measure. One pilot, Lieutenant Colonel William Dunham, flew 106 ground attack missions. He was hit by ground fire on almost every one. He was shot down twice and walked back to Allied lines both times. His total score included one Me-262 jet, shot down while Dunham was flying a ground attack mission and spotted the German jet taking off from an airfield below. When asked about his survival rate, Dunham credited the aircraft entirely. "Any other plane, I'd be dead 10 times over. The jug just refuses to quit." By 1945, P-47s had dropped more bombs on German targets than any other fighter type. They had destroyed more ground targets than any other aircraft in the theater. And they had done it while maintaining the lowest loss rate per sortie of any ground attack aircraft. Kartveli had designed a fighter. The war had turned it into something more, the most versatile combat aircraft of its generation. Now let me tell you about one specific day that demonstrates everything the P-47 could do. March 14, 1945. The location was a German airfield called Gütersloh. The 56th Fighter Group was assigned to attack the airfield, part of a larger operation to destroy the remnants of the Luftwaffe on the ground before they could fly. Intelligence reported that dozens of German aircraft were dispersed around the field. Major Felix Williamson led the strike force, 16 P-47s loaded with bombs and full ammunition. They hit the airfield at dawn. The attack was devastatingly effective. P-47s swept across the field at treetop level, bombing hangars and strafing dispersed aircraft. German anti-aircraft guns opened up, filling the sky with tracers. This is where the P-47's survivability became crucial. Every aircraft in the strike force was hit, every single one. Lieutenant Harold Barnaby took a 37mm anti-aircraft shell through his wing. The shell didn't explode. It passed clean through, leaving a hole the size of a basketball. Barnaby completed his strafing run, dropped his bombs, and flew home. Lieutenant James Finnegan had his engine cowling torn off by ground fire. Oil sprayed across his windscreen, blinding him. He pulled up, wiped the oil away, and discovered his engine was still running. He flew home. Captain Joseph Perry had his rudder shot away. The aircraft wanted to spin, but Perry managed to control it with ailerons and trim. He flew home. Williamson himself took a hit that severed his hydraulic lines. He had no brakes and no flaps. He landed at high speed, ran off the end of the runway, and walked away. When the strike force assembled after the mission, 16 pilots reported 16 damaged aircraft. 16 aircraft had been hit by ground fire. 16 pilots had returned safely. They had destroyed 31 German aircraft on the ground and damaged dozens more. Any other fighter in the world would have lost at least half the strike force. The P-47 brought everyone home. Now let me tell you about Neil Kirby and the most incredible single air combat mission of the Pacific War. Colonel Neil Ernest Kirby was born in Wichita Falls, Texas on June 5, 1911. Unlike Johnson or Gabreski, Kirby was already an experienced pilot when the war began. He had been flying for the Army Air Corps since 1937. Kirby was intense, competitive, and absolutely convinced that the P-47 was the finest fighter aircraft in the world. When he was assigned to the Pacific Theater in 1943, he made it his personal mission to prove that the Thunderbolt could dominate the Japanese just as effectively as it was dominating the Germans over Europe. The Pacific was different from Europe. The distances were vast, hundreds of miles of open ocean between bases and targets. The enemy was different too. Japanese pilots in their Zeros and Oscars were extraordinarily skilled, and their aircraft were incredibly maneuverable. Many American pilots thought the heavy P-47 was wrong for the Pacific. They wanted the lighter P-38 Lightning or the nimble P-51 Mustang. Kirby disagreed violently. October 11, 1943. Kirby was leading a flight of just 4 P-47s on a fighter sweep over Wewak, New Guinea. This was deep in Japanese-held territory. The mission was to find and destroy enemy aircraft. They found them. Coming out of the clouds, Kirby spotted a formation below, and his heart must have nearly stopped. There were between 30 and 40 Japanese aircraft, bombers escorted by fighters, heading toward Allied positions. 4 P-47s against 40 Japanese planes. Any sensible commander would have reported the contact and withdrawn. The odds were insane. But Kirby wasn't sensible. He was a P-47 pilot. He led his flight into the attack. What followed was one of the most extraordinary individual performances in aviation history. Kirby dove into the Japanese formation with his guns blazing. In the first pass, he destroyed a bomber. He pulled up, rolled over, and dove again. Another kill. The Japanese fighters were reacting now, trying to get on his tail, but Kirby used the P-47's diving speed to stay ahead of them. Kill number 3. Number 4. The Japanese formation was scattering in confusion. Kirby's wingmen were fighting their own battles. Lieutenant John Moore got 2 kills. The other 2 pilots scored 1 each. But Kirby wasn't finished. He found another group of Japanese aircraft and attacked again. Kill number 5, then number 6. 6 confirmed victories in a single mission. It was the highest single mission score by any American pilot in the Pacific theater. It would stand as a record for months. When Kirby landed back at base, his gun camera footage confirmed everything. 6 Japanese aircraft destroyed in approximately 8 minutes of combat. His P-47 had taken hits, it always did, but nothing serious. Nothing that stopped him from flying again the next day. For this mission, Neil Kirby received the Medal of Honor. The citation noted his conspicuous gallantry and intrepidity above and beyond the call of duty. But it might as well have noted the aircraft that made such gallantry possible. In any other fighter, Kirby's aggressive tactics would have gotten him killed. The P-47's speed, firepower, and survivability turned a reckless attack into a historic victory. Tragically, Kirby's luck ran out on March 5, 1944. He was shot down over New Guinea with 22 confirmed victories, the 3rd highest American score in the Pacific at the time. But his legend lived on, and every P-47 pilot in the Pacific knew the lesson of October 11th. In the right hands, the Thunderbolt could take on any odds and win. Let me tell you about another aspect of the P-47 that doesn't get enough attention. The men who kept them flying. Ground crews. Every fighter pilot who returned home owed his life not just to Alexander Kartveli, but to the mechanics, armorers, and technicians who worked through the night to keep their aircraft airworthy. The P-47 was a complex machine. Its R-2800 engine had 18 cylinders arranged in 2 rows. Its turbo supercharger, the device that gave it high-altitude performance, was a precision instrument that required constant adjustment. Its 8 machine guns needed to be cleaned, aligned, and loaded with thousands of rounds before every mission. Ground crews worked in freezing English winters and sweltering Pacific summers. They worked by flashlight when the lights had to be kept off for blackout. They worked through air raids, through equipment shortages, through exhaustion, and they performed miracles. A P-47 that landed with a shot-up engine would be flying again within 48 hours. Aircraft that should have been written off were patched, repaired, and returned to service. Spare parts that didn't exist were fabricated from scrap metal and ingenuity. The crew chiefs, the senior mechanics responsible for individual aircraft, developed personal relationships with their planes and pilots. They knew every quirk, every weakness, every modification. When their pilot returned safely, they felt a pride that matched any combat decoration. One crew chief, Master Sergeant Frank Lawson of the 56th Fighter Group, kept a notebook of every mission his aircraft flew. Over 2 years, that P-47, nicknamed Lucky, flew 187 combat missions with 3 different pilots. It was hit by enemy fire 31 times. It never failed to bring its pilot home. Lawson's notebook is now in the National Air and Space Museum. It's a testament to the unsung heroes who made the P-47's legendary survivability possible. Because the aircraft could take punishment and keep flying, but only if skilled hands repaired that punishment before the next mission. There's another story I need to tell you. It's about what the P-47 did in the final weeks of the war, when German resistance was collapsing and the Thunderbolts roamed freely across the Reich. April 1945. The Third Reich was dying. Allied armies were pushing from the west. Soviet armies were pushing from the east. German cities were being reduced to rubble. The Nazi regime that had terrorized Europe for 12 years was in its death throes. And in the skies above Germany, P-47s were everywhere. By this point in the war, there was almost nothing left for them to fight. The Luftwaffe was finished, grounded by fuel shortages, pilot losses, and the destruction of its airfields. German anti-aircraft defenses, once fearsome, were running out of ammunition. The Thunderbolts shifted entirely to ground attack, and they destroyed what remained of Germany's ability to wage war. Trains were the primary target. Germany depended on rail transport to move troops, supplies, and war materials. The P-47 pilots became experts at attacking locomotives. The technique was precise. You came in low, treetop level, and aimed for the boiler. 850 caliber machine guns would punch through the locomotive's skin like paper. The boiler would explode in a spectacular eruption of steam and metal. In April 1945 alone, P-47s destroyed over 2,500 locomotives. The German rail network, already battered, simply stopped functioning. But there were other targets too. Trucks, staff cars, horse-drawn wagons, anything that moved on German roads was fair game. Barges on canals, factories that were still operating, fuel depots, ammunition dumps. The pilots called it the Great Turkey Shoot. There was no sport in it, just methodical destruction of an enemy that could no longer fight back. Some pilots felt uncomfortable. This wasn't aerial combat. This was execution. But they also knew what they were destroying. They were destroying the trucks that would have carried ammunition to German troops fighting the Allied advance. They were destroying the trains that would have transported reinforcements. They were destroying the infrastructure that prolonged the war. Every locomotive that exploded was a battle that wouldn't be fought. Every truck that burned was ammunition that wouldn't kill Allied soldiers. Every day the war continued was a day more people died. Soldiers, civilians, prisoners in concentration camps. The P-47 pilots were ending the war, one target at a time. On May 8, 1945, Germany surrendered. The Thunderbolts flew their last combat missions that morning, patrol flights over the suddenly silent German landscape. Pilots reported an eerie quiet. No flak, no fighters, no targets. Just the wreckage of a nation that had brought devastation upon itself and the world. The war in Europe was over. The P-47 had been there from the beginning of America's air war, the first escorts over France in 1943, to the very end. It had evolved from a controversial, unloved replacement to the most effective fighter bomber in the theater, and it had brought its pilots home. I want to take a moment to talk about what was happening on the German side. By 1944, Luftwaffe pilots had developed a healthy respect for the P-47. They had learned its strengths and weaknesses. They knew they could outturn it. They knew they could outclimb it at low altitude. But they also knew something else. Shooting down a P-47 was incredibly difficult. German pilots reported hitting Thunderbolts with multiple cannon shells and watching them fly away. They reported setting P-47s on fire only to see the fires go out. They reported attacks that should have been kills turning into escapes. This had a psychological effect. Fighting a Spitfire or a Mustang, a German pilot knew that a good hit would bring results. The enemy would smoke, spiral, crash. There was a direct connection between skill and outcome. Fighting a P-47 was different. You could do everything right, get the perfect bounce, land solid hits, break away cleanly, and still watch the American fly away. It was demoralizing. One German ace, Heinz Baer, wrote after the war, "The Thunderbolt was the opponent I least wanted to face. Not because it was dangerous in combat, the 109 could handle it in a dogfight, but because killing one was so difficult. You would hit it and hit it and hit it, and still it would fly. It made you doubt your own abilities." This psychological dimension mattered. By late 1944, Luftwaffe morale was already crumbling. Facing an enemy that simply refused to die made it worse. The P-47 wasn't just a weapon, it was a statement. America could build aircraft that absorbed punishment and kept fighting. Germany could not match that industrial philosophy. Every P-47 that returned home was a reminder of the production capacity that was crushing the Reich. There's one more dimension of the P-47 story that I need to address: the aircraft's service with other nations. America wasn't the only country flying Thunderbolts. Under Lend-Lease, P-47s were provided to Britain, France, Brazil, Mexico, and the Soviet Union. Each country used them differently, but all of them discovered the same thing. This aircraft was extraordinarily difficult to destroy. The Free French Air Force received P-47s in 1944 and used them extensively during the liberation of France. French pilots, many of whom had been flying since 1940, were initially skeptical of the heavy American fighter. They were accustomed to lighter, more nimble aircraft. But the P-47 won them over. One French pilot, Pierre Clostermann, wrote a memoir called The Big Show that became a classic of aviation literature. In it, he described the P-47's unique character. The Thunderbolt was not a fighter in the traditional sense. It was a weapon of brute force. You did not dance with the enemy, you crushed him. And when the enemy tried to crush you back, the Thunderbolt simply absorbed the blows and kept fighting. Klosterman, who flew Spitfires, Tempests, and P-47s during the war, ultimately scored 11 of his 33 victories in the Thunderbolt. He never lost the aircraft's unique charm. The Brazilian Air Force also flew P-47s, the only South American nation to send combat units to the European theater. Brazilian pilots flew ground attack missions over Italy in 1944 and 1945, destroying German vehicles and installations with the same devastating effectiveness as their American counterparts. When the war ended, Brazil kept its Thunderbolts in service until 1957. They were beloved aircraft, symbols of the nation's contribution to Allied victory. Even the Soviet Union received P-47s, though in smaller numbers than other Lend-Lease aircraft. Soviet pilots found the Thunderbolt's size and weight unusual. Their own fighters were designed for maximum lightness, but they appreciated its firepower and its ability to take damage. The P-47's international service proved that Kartveli's design philosophy wasn't just American. It was universal. Pilots from every nation discovered the same truth: survival matters more than specification sheets. Let me tell you about the end of Alexander Kartveli's war. By 1945, Republic Aviation had built over 15,000 P-47 Thunderbolts. It was the largest production run of any American fighter in history. Factories in New York and Indiana worked around the clock, turning out aircraft that were shipped to every theater of the war. Kartveli watched the production numbers with quiet satisfaction, but he was already thinking about the future. The jet age was coming. German Me-262s were appearing over the battlefield. British Meteors were operational. The piston engine fighter, even one as magnificent as the P-47, would soon be obsolete. Kartveli's response was the F-84 Thunderjet, America's first jet fighter designed for both air combat and ground attack. It flew in 1946 and would serve in Korea. Later came the F-105 Thunderchief, the largest single-engine combat aircraft ever built, designed specifically for nuclear strike missions. It would become the workhorse of the Vietnam War. Each design carried Kartveli's philosophy forward: build strong, build survivable, bring the pilot home. Alexander Kartveli died on July 20, 1974, in New York City. He was 77 years old. The obituaries called him one of the greatest aircraft designers in American history. But his real legacy was simpler than any obituary could capture. Thousands of pilots came home because Alexander Kartveli believed their lives mattered more than any performance specification. Thousands of families had husbands and fathers after the war because a Georgian refugee designed a plane that refused to die. The Jug, the flying milk truck, the pregnant whale, the P-47 Thunderbolt. There's one final chapter to this story, a legacy that extends far beyond World War II. When the Cold War began, the United States Air Force started designing a new generation of combat aircraft. Jets replaced propellers, speeds doubled, then tripled. Fighters became sleek, fast, sophisticated machines packed with electronics and guided missiles. But something was lost. The new jets were fragile. They were complex. A single bullet in the wrong place could bring down a $20 million aircraft. Pilots who ejected over enemy territory rarely came home. In Vietnam, this became a crisis. American aircraft were being shot down in alarming numbers. The sophisticated jets that were supposed to dominate the battlefield were proving vulnerable to simple anti-aircraft guns and shoulder-launched missiles. The Air Force needed a new ground attack aircraft. Something tough, something survivable, something that could absorb damage and keep flying. They needed, in essence, a modern P-47. The aircraft they designed was the A-10 Thunderbolt II. The name was no accident. The A-10's designers explicitly cited the P-47 as their inspiration. They built an aircraft around the same philosophy that Alexander Kartveli had championed 30 years earlier. The pilot must come home. The A-10 has a titanium bathtub around the cockpit that can withstand 23mm cannon fire. Its fuel tanks are self-sealing and filled with fire-suppressing foam. Its engines are mounted high to protect them from ground fire. Its flight controls are duplicated. If hydraulics fail, manual backups take over. It is, in many ways, the spiritual descendant of the P-47. And just like the Thunderbolt, the A-10 has proven extraordinarily difficult to destroy. In the Gulf War, in Afghanistan, in Iraq, A-10s have returned to base with damage that would have downed any other aircraft in the inventory. One A-10 pilot, Captain Kim Campbell, flew her aircraft home in 2003 after it was hit by anti-aircraft fire that destroyed the hydraulic system and blew a massive hole in the tail. She landed using only manual controls, something that shouldn't have been possible. When asked how she survived, Campbell gave an answer that Robert Johnson would have recognized. "The aircraft saved my life. It just refused to die." That's Alexander Kartveli's legacy. Not just the P-47, but a philosophy of design that prioritizes survival. A philosophy that treats pilots as human beings with families waiting for them, not as replaceable components in a war machine. The pilot must come home. It was true in 1943 over Europe. It's true today over wherever American aircraft are flying. Some principles never go out of date. If you want to understand what the P-47 meant to the men who flew it, you need to read their letters home. Robert Johnson wrote to his wife, "I have been hit so many times I've lost count. Any other ship I'd be dead. But the old jug just keeps bringing me back to you." Francis Gabreski wrote from his prison camp, "I walked away from a crash that should have killed me. The airplane saved my life even as it was dying." Hub Zemka, after the war, gave a speech to a reunion of 56th Fighter Group veterans. By then, he was a colonel, a hero, a legend. He could have talked about tactics, about victory, about the glory of aerial combat. Instead, he talked about the aircraft. "We lost good men over there, too many good men. But we brought home hundreds who should have died. Every pilot in this room owes their life to that ugly, wonderful, indestructible airplane, and to the man who designed it." There was a standing ovation. Some of the men were crying. That's the legacy of the P-47 Thunderbolt. Not the kill counts or the tonnage dropped or the records broken. The legacy is the men who came home. Let me give you the final numbers. P-47s flew 546,000 combat sorties in World War II. They destroyed 11,874 enemy aircraft, more than any other American fighter. They destroyed over 9 dozen locomotives and nearly 160,000 railway cars and motor vehicles. The P-47 achieved an aerial kill ratio of 4.6 to 1. For every Thunderbolt lost in air combat, 4.6 enemy aircraft were destroyed. More importantly, the P-47 had the lowest loss rate per sortie of any American fighter in the European theater. Pilots who flew P-47s had a higher survival rate than pilots who flew any other American fighter. That's the number that mattered to Alexander Kartveli. That's the number that matters to me. I want to leave you with one final image. It's 1944, somewhere over Germany. A P-47 is limping toward England with an engine trailing smoke, a wing missing 3 feet of its tip, a cockpit splattered with oil, and a pilot who has every reason to believe he's about to die. But the engine keeps running. The wing keeps generating lift. The controls keep responding. And the pilot, maybe Johnson, maybe Gabreski, maybe one of the thousands whose names we don't remember, realizes that he's going to make it. Against all odds, against all logic, against everything the German gunners threw at him, he's going home. He's going home because a refugee from Georgia designed an aircraft around a simple idea. The pilot matters more than the machine. The pilot must come home. And 15,000 times, through every kind of damage and disaster that combat could inflict, the P-47 Thunderbolt kept that promise. That's all for today, my friends. If this story moved you, if you appreciate what these pilots endured and what one brilliant engineer created, I'd be grateful if you'd share it with someone who loves aviation history. Subscribe if you haven't already. Next week, we're going into another story of the machines and men who won the war, another chapter that deserves to be remembered. Until then, I'm Matt Donovan. Stay curious, honor the veterans, and remember, sometimes the greatest innovation isn't speed or power or maneuverability. Sometimes it's simply bringing people home. I'll see you in the next one.